Welcome to week 3 of hazardous waste and public law. This week we're going to be covering RCRA, hazardous waste disposal generator and transporter requirements. This is a tremendously large subject. Books have been written on this topic. So I'm going to give you a brief 5-slide overview of some of the fundamentals, and hopefully that'll be enough to whet your appetite and encourage you to continue to study on your own and learn this material very, very well. RCRA is considered a cradle-to-grave program. What this means is that the program requires that waste materials to be classified up front as to whether they're hazardous or not, and also that there be written manifests to track these hazardous waste shipments from where they're generated until where they're disposed. And last, that there be certification of the disposal facilities for these hazardous wastes through a permit system. For hazardous materials to be subject to RCRA regulation, they must first fall under the definition of solid waste before the question of whether the hazardous material needs to be explored. The solid waste definition for RCRA is extremely broad. For the most part, it includes discarded semisolids, liquids, or even containerized gases. Another aspect to consider is whether a material that might be considered either waste or hazardous waste could potentially be exempt from the RCRA laws. Many items are written into the law to exclude them from RCRA requirements. So how do you determine what wastes are hazardous? RCRA requires the EPA to develop criteria for identifying hazardous wastes in one of two ways. The first way is by listing a waste as hazardous, and the second way is by determining whether a waste is hazardous because of certain characteristics. Hazardous wastes are defined as solid wastes that either cause or significantly contribute to an increase in mortality or reversible illness, or they pose a substantial hazard to human health or the environment when improperly handled. A listed hazardous waste is the simplest way that the EPA can designate a waste as hazardous. There are several ways or criteria to determine if it's listed. The first is if a waste exhibits ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity. The second way is if a waste may be considered acutely toxic, or a waste contains certain toxic constituents and is capable of posing substantial harm. A characteristic hazardous waste is the more common way the EPA determines if a waste is hazardous. A material cannot be deemed hazardous unless the characteristic in question can be measured by an available standardized test method that is reasonably feasible, or unless the characteristic can be reasonably detected through general knowledge of the waste. A material may also be deemed hazardous if it exhibits one of 4 characteristics. The first one, ignitability. The second one, corrosivity. The third one, reactivity. And the fourth one is toxicity. Toxicity is often determined by a complicated laboratory procedure called the Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure, either TCLIP or TCLP. RCRA and EPA regulations also define hazardous waste to include certain mixtures of hazardous and non-hazardous materials. For example, if you took a small portion of a hazardous material and placed it in a 55-gallon drum of non-hazardous material, you would have 55 gallons of hazardous material. The next slide actually covers the requirements for generators in great detail, so I won't mention anything at this point and just refer you to the next slide, but be aware that there are specific and a high number of requirements for generators. For transporters of hazardous waste, they also have additional requirements. They must sign and date manifests delivering shipments to the designated facility, record-keeping requirements, transfer facility requirements, and also what to do if there's a release of the hazardous waste in transport. Then the last thing is not to forget that the Department of Transportation also has rules regarding transportation of hazardous materials. TSDFs also have a specific list of requirements under RCRA. One of the most important is a general waste analysis, in which they're required to get all of the information which must be known to treat, store, and dispose of waste in accordance to all standards and requirements. This includes various aspects of operating records, biennial reports, being ready for inspections, and having a waste analysis plan. An interesting aspect of RCRA is the land disposal of hazardous wastes, commonly called a land ban. In 1984, Congress passed the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments, in which prohibit all land disposal of hazardous wastes except when substances are treated satisfactorily or a petition is granted. The last item to consider here is the export of hazardous waste. RCRA requires informed consent before export of hazardous waste may take place. And this informed consent can show itself in many ways. Some of those ways would be you'd have to notify the EPA of intent to export wastes 60 days before the initial shipment. There would be special manifest requirements, annual reports, record keeping, and last but not least, any international agreements regarding hazardous waste. This slide on RCRA generator comparison can rightfully be called busy because there's a lot of information in a small amount of space. The key items here to consider are on the very top. You have the 3 generator statuses: the condition exempt small quantity generator, the small quantity generator, and the large quantity generator. And the rows to the left give you an idea of the different areas that each of the generators is required to evaluate and comply with. And these areas include items such as how much waste is generated per month, quantity limits, how much can you accumulate, how long can you accumulate it, what are the storage requirements, are there any manifesting requirements, reporting, training, contingency plans, emergency procedures, and also DOT transportation requirements. You're not expected to have all this memorized or even totally understood. Just be aware that all this information is summarized, and you can dig into it in more detail at your leisure for any particular item that piques your interest.